Okay, guys. This is Miss Sinclair from University High School, continuing on with the Unit 5 Revolutions lecture for AP World History. And today we're going to talk about the French Revolution. The French Revolution is absurd, and it's very fun to talk about. So, your objective, you'll be able to explain how the Enlightenment affected societies over time. We are going to talk about the French Revolution. Okay, so the French Revolution is violent, it's chaotic, and it is very different from the American Revolution. So let's start with our context. All right, in France at this time, you have what's known as the three estates. We've talked about the three estates for a long time, but there hasn't been a constant in conversation. So there are essentially three categories to French society. There is the first estate, made up of the clergy, which is essentially just the church at the end of the day. Nope. Well, it is the church, but it's essentially just nobility at the end of the day. The second estate is the nobility, and the third is everyone else, from wealthy merchants to beggars. Okay, so remember, France has an absolute monarchy. They're like the most absolute monarchy of everyone, except for maybe Russia, right? Think Louis XIV, think Versailles, the Hall of Mirrors. And so French society is very stratified. These first estates make up what was known as the Estates General. So hypothetically, in an ideal world, the Estates General would be called by the king, and they would meet and discuss issues and make legislation. But not in an absolute monarchy. I mean, who do you think this is? Britain? Come on. So instead, the Estates General hasn't been called for like 200 years. We have a highly imbalanced economy. The church owns 10% of all the nation's land. They get lots of money from tithes and don't pay any taxes. The nobility owns 30% of the land and hold all administrative, judicial, military, and church positions. So the nobility holds literally all the power. And the third estate is everyone else. Now, it used to be, way back when, that you had like the king and like the nobility and then the peasants, and that was it. And like frankly, like medieval period, if you're a noble, you're not living that much better than the peasant living outside the castle walls. Not so much in the 19th century, right? Now you have the American colonies, you have all this wealth coming in, you have population boom in Paris, you have wealthy merchants now, a middle class in France who feel they should have more voice in policy. You see commerce, finance, manufacturing accounting for a lot of the wealth of the merchants in the third estate. They are socially ambitious. They are literate. They are supporting publishing, fine arts. They are building new homes in Paris. They are not to be ignored. Then you have your peasants. The peasants make up 80% of the French population, and it is a bad time to be a French peasant. You have high rates of poverty. Like, you cannot feed your kids. You send your kids out for seasonal work because you can't feed them at home, and hopefully someone else can. You see lots of crime, begging, prostitution, and it's even worse in the cities. Vile conditions, right? We are not in a Paris of the famed sewer system of Les Miserables. This is refuse in the street. Feces are just being dumped out of windows. It is overpopulated. There is not enough food. There is not enough housing. It is cold. And 12 miles outside the city, you have the Palace of Versailles, right? Opulent luxury, gold on the walls. People have a short life expectancy. They have an unhealthy diet. And we see that the streets are full of beggars and prostitutes. France at this time has a huge problem of child abandonment. French parents gave up at least 40,000 kids a year. They believe that their kids are going to be adopted, sent to a better home, given a better life than what they can offer them. But the reality is, most of them just died of neglect. So, unable to afford decent housing, have a steady job, protect their children, the poor often erupted in violent rage. Right? They lived on the edge of survival at all times. A slight increase in bread or taxes might lead to starvation for your family. I am not exaggerating. So, when you are living on the edge and you are so frustrated and you feel so trapped and unable to change your circumstances in life, it doesn't take much to push you to revolution. Take a look at that painting on the slide. You see the crown, the church, the nobility, all sitting on the back of the third estate. Look how fat those men are. You see they're holding whips. They are opulently dressed. And then the third estate is being ridden like a horse. He is blindfolded. He is shackled. He is bleeding. If you look and you see that the crown is actively putting spurs into his leg, go faster. It's not going to take much to make these people decide to riot. Not to mention, economically, France is not in a great position. They are super in debt from a bunch of different wars. So they get involved in like every war in Europe. France, you should really try and pick and choose your wars. So they get involved in the wars of Austrian succession. You have the 7 Years' War with Britain. These two wars alone almost bankrupt France. Then you have Louis XVI take the throne in 1774 and promptly decide to fund the American Revolution. Thank you, we appreciate it, but I'm not sure your economy can handle it. More than 50% of France's budget just went towards paying interest on its debt, not even paying the debt down. So what's a king to do? Well, he needs to raise taxes on the nobility. And that means he needs to call the Estates General. So in 1789, he calls the Estates General together. This is the first time they've met since 1614. And for the third estate, they see this as their chance. They want to talk about tax control, Louis XVI wants to talk about tax reform, and that's it, nothing else. The third estate wants to talk about making France a constitutional monarchy. They look at Britain, and they look at the United States, and they think, we can do that. Not to mention all of these Enlightenment ideas. Paris is the intellectual heart of Europe. All of our Enlightenment thinkers are here. The works are being published here. The French salons are meeting here. They're talking about these ideas. How would they practically work? What did Rousseau mean? What did John Locke mean? What does Voltaire mean? How do we see this playing out? What would the plan be? The third estate's ready. Now, who do you think is showing up for the third estate? It's not the peasants. It's not the beggars, right? It's the wealthy of the third estate. It's the wealthy merchants who are essentially at the same social standing as the nobility, just without the fancy title. So, full of vigor and Enlightenment ideas, we see that Louis XVI loses control of this third estate. He calls the Estates General to talk about tax reform. They want to talk about other stuff. And so he locks them out. A few members of the third estate, of the first and second estates, nobles, priests, join them as they start calling themselves the National Assembly. During lunch, essentially, Louis locks them out of the meeting room. What does he think this is? Right? Oh, if they're not in the room, their ideas don't count. It's like out of sight, out of mind. How much of a silver spoon must you have been raised with to think that would work? He panics and locks them out of the meeting room. So they go to the tennis court and they write a constitution. They have what's known as the tennis court oath, which is essentially their pledge to create a national assembly that truly honors the people of France, that creates a constitutional monarchy that embodies these Enlightenment ideals. While this is happening, Louis calls the army. The bourgeoisie members of this National Assembly insisted on one vote per representative instead of one vote per estate. This was the issue that broke the day, right? When it's one vote per estate, the nobles and the clergy are always going to team up against the third estate. Not if you have more representatives from the third estate than the other two. Meanwhile, quick side note, so much of this happens so fast that there's going to be a lot of meanwhile. So, meanwhile, while the National Assembly is forming in Versailles at the tennis court, nearly a third of Paris is out of work and starving. They are frustrated. They are sitting around and they are just talking about ideas. They're talking about what's happening just 12 miles away. They're talking about this plan to form a National Assembly. And then they hear the king is calling the troops. The king is calling in the army against the third estate. They are going to crush this hope for the future before it can even come to fruition. So what do the people of Paris do? What they always do. They riot. They overthrow the Bastille. It's known as the storming of the Bastille. If you ever go to Paris and you're in there on July 14th, you'll see the celebrations of Bastille Day. The Bastille was originally a fortress, a prison, although now it was used primarily to hold political prisoners, people who have criticized the crown or upset the king in some way. So, the people of Paris react violently. It's not just like, oh, let's take control of the Bastille and set the prisoners free. No, they hack the commander to death and then parade around town with his head on a stick. But don't worry, it wasn't just the commander, it was the officers who were with him as well. How mad do you have to be to not only take control of a prison, but to decide, you know what the appropriate move is? Hack the commanders to death who are just there because it's their job, and then parade around town with their heads on sticks like some sort of sick puppet. Meanwhile, while this is happening in Paris, in the countryside, peasants are sacking manors. They are breaking into the mansions and palaces that their nobles live in. They are burning the documents that show their debt. Heck, if I could burn a piece of paper and get rid of all of my student loans, I totally would. They are refusing to pay taxes. They are seizing common lands. It's utter chaos. Utter chaos. The king no longer has control of his country. The countryside is burning. Paris is rioting. And you have a new government, a new National Assembly, which votes to end the feudal system and issues the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This, along with the Declaration of Independence, are two really important primary sources from this time period. It's useful to compare the two documents. In the same way, it's really useful to compare the two revolutions. The American Revolution is not really revolutionary, right? At the end of the day, those in power fought to remain in power, right? They just wanted to expand their power and privilege by getting rid of the British crown. One of the things that's going to make the French Revolution so different is that it is actually revolutionary. The people of Paris, the peasants in France, don't want the status quo to stay the same. They want to get theirs. They want to reform the entire social hierarchy. They want to change every aspect of their society. And it's not going to work. I mean, that's one of the reasons why the American Revolution was actually successful, because not much changed at the end of the day. They're going to want to change everything here. So the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen is a statement of political rights adopted by the French National Assembly at the beginning of the French Revolution. It is similar in language to the Declaration of Independence, and it is not a constitution, right? This is not outlining the structure of government, who has power, voting rights, blah, blah, blah. No. This is just a statement about what they believe and who they are and what they want. So they want the liberty, they want the right to property, to security, to resist oppression. What does this sound like? If you're thinking John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Hobbes, you are right. Again, what were one of the main factors leading up to all these revolutions? The answer is always going to be the Enlightenment. Meanwhile, this is not happening all the same day, but it's happening like so fast. Meanwhile, the women in Paris march on Versailles. The economic situation is getting worse. I mean, it makes sense. You've overthrown the government. The countryside is on fire. Your neighbors are a little bit worried about the fact that the countryside's on fire, so has stopped doing business with you. So the economic situation is just getting worse. Women in particular are hit hard because they are the ones who go to market and try and buy food. So they're the ones who are often left standing around for hours waiting for bread. They can't feed their families. They are pissed. They are so angry. And they start talking. You know who I bet never goes hungry? The Queen. You know whose children never go to bed crying? The Prince and Princess. You have to understand that Marie Antoinette is from Austria. She has always grown up in luxury, and she probably never said, let them eat cake. But like the media today, there was tabloids and propaganda. And so there were tabloids about Marie Antoinette talking about, how her life of luxury was, how she bathed in champagne and how she wore a different set of silk stockings every day. She never wore them twice. And how she always had cake with every meal and how she threw away so much of her food, right? Even if it wasn't true, it didn't matter. It was that idea that just 12 miles away, there's a woman who never has to starve. She never has to sell her body. She never has to go through the hardships that these Parisian women have to live with every day. The reality is not as important as the perception here. And they are mad and they feel powerless and they see what the men did with the Bastille and they think, let's go get some. Let's get some of that bread. Let's get some of that champagne, that gold. Let's go to Versailles. So they march the 12 miles to Versailles. They just want bread. They enter Versailles. They search for the Queen. And they find her. And they force the royal family to move to Paris. When I was in college, I was in a really interesting class that had us sort of act out turning points in history in real time. We did the English Reformation and the French Revolution. And part of the way that the class went is we were each assigned a role. And it wasn't like acting, but we were meant to accurately, from a historical standpoint, represent this person's argument in history and see if things would play out the same way. So in the English Reformation, I played Thomas More, and I was beheaded. In the French Revolution, I represented the people of Paris. I won. Everyone died, except for me. I won. At one point, I balled up pieces of paper and hurled it at the king and queen. It was great. So the king is held hostage in Paris by the people of Paris and by this new National Assembly. You have a new constitution laid out by this new National Assembly with new individual rights. They forced the king to sign, and now France is a parliamentary monarchy, just like Britain. They demand rights for civic equality. They limit monarchical power. They reform the economy. They remove trade barriers. They seize control of the church and all of its wealth. At first, the rest of Europe is pretty cool with having a weaker French king, right? France was one of the most powerful countries in Europe. So if they're in chaos, great. They're less of a threat to the rest of us, and we can take some of that power that they have lost. But then they start to get worried when they see how radical this revolution is. What if it spreads to our own people? If you remember, I said Marie Antoinette was originally a princess of Austria. So in 1791, Austria and Prussia threatened to intervene to put the king back on the throne. And the Legislative Assembly, the National Assembly, declares war. Meanwhile, one woman you should know is Olympia de Georges. She's a French feminist, and she is going to apply Enlightenment ideas to women. She's going to write the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen because she's frustrated that the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen ignores women. Most of 19th century feminism is really focused on the idea of suffrage, the right to vote. And these will really challenge traditional political and gender hierarchies. When we get to the Industrial Revolution, these will change even more. There's a very silly video about the French Revolution set to Lady Gaga. I recommend you watch it. You should be able to compare and contrast the American and French Revolution, right? Practicing those AP skills, comparison. So let's think about this a little bit. The French Revolution is going to be way more violent than the American Revolution from the get-go. The American Revolution has actual armies fighting against each other, whereas the French Revolution is much more just people rioting in the streets. The American Revolution and the French Revolution are both going to apply Enlightenment ideas, but the American Revolution is going to seek to ultimately just remove monarchical power from their system, but everything else stays the same. Slaves stay slaves, landowners stay owning land. The French Revolution wants to change it all, right? The poor people of Paris don't want to be poor anymore. They want the gold. They want a better life, and they're not going to be satisfied with anything less. So that's going to be what leads to the terror, the chaos. It's not just enough to have a new government and call it good. This is not enough change for the people of Paris. This is not enough. We are not satisfied. And as it becomes clear that the rest of Europe wants this revolution to fail, as people get concerned about counter-revolutionary plots, they start to panic. They start to get scared. They start to get mad and realize that they got themselves into this hole and they don't know how they're going to get themselves out. And so you have the leader of a group in the National Assembly named Maximilien Robespierre. He is going to really be the architect of the terror. You also have the rise of the Jacobins. The Jacobins are radical Republicans during the French Revolution. So the Committee of Public Safety is going to be the one that really leads the terror. And the concern is counter-revolutionary threats, people who want to end the revolution, who put the king back on the throne, to make things go back to the way they were. To be fair, some people did want that, right? That wasn't a completely insane idea. But the paranoia that comes along with it, ooh, that's too much. So they use the guillotine. The guillotine is a tool for execution. I'm sure you've seen one before. If you haven't, it's essentially a big rectangle with a really sharp knife at the top. So you put your head at the bottom. They let gravity do the work. It drops the heavy blade, beheading you instantly. It was actually seen as a more humane way to execute someone. And to be fair, like, I see that point. right? Your options were otherwise being hung, but if you weren't heavy enough, your neck might not break when the gates opened and you would just strangle to death. That's pretty miserable. Or beheaded by a dude with an axe. But what if the axe isn't sharp? What if the dude isn't strong enough? What if his grip slips? What if it takes multiple hits? Again, not consistent. The guillotine, you die quickly every time. The terror is going to spread far beyond Paris, even if that is its heart. 40,000 people will die in the terror in and around Paris, and 300,000 will be imprisoned. And it is going to be Maximilien Robespierre who executes the King and Marie Antoinette in 1792 for conspiring against the nation. Again, technically, they did do those things. They were set free by some supporters and were captured by the army on their way to Austria. Remember, France is currently at war with Austria and Prussia. They're brought back to Paris and beheaded. And once you kill the king, you can kill anyone. So he purges all of his political enemies. He creates the Committee of Public Safety, a special court to seek out and punish enemies of the revolution. It's a kangaroo court, right? There's no real justice here. There's no real defense. You could just take out anyone who you didn't like. Oh, did you hear so-and-so was talking about how good things were back when Louis was still king? So-and-so misses the crown. So-and-so is saying how much he hates the revolution. Off with their head. I mean, that's it. We're done. Interestingly enough, at this second stage of the revolution, women start to lose all influence. And it's really this cult of supreme being, right? Robespierre goes crazy with power. Obviously, this is highly generalized. Robespierre is obviously a complex individual, and the entire French Revolution is so much more complex than this. But for our purposes, this is what you need to know. So Robespierre starts to execute all of his allies. He starts getting so paranoid until eventually he is left without allies, and he is executed, beheaded by his own guillotine. So the new constitution of France had universal male suffrage. It had military conscription, so all male citizens had to serve in the military. Remember, we're at war. And it was forcing priests to marry. So this second stage of the revolution was much more radical, right? It's not just enough, let's give people the right to vote. But let's get rid of all traditions having to do with the church. They get rid of Sundays. They renamed the days of the week, right? This is not going to work out for them in the long run. So what was the role the Estates General played in forming the French Revolution? What major event occurs during the Reign of Terror? There's a great crash course on the French Revolution, and now that there's Crash Course European History, you can get more depth and detail if you want it. But let's talk about Napoleon, because you're going to have a conservative reaction to all this chaos. Napoleon's an interesting dude. He is Corsican, so he's not technically French. He and also was not that short. He was average height. But he comes from money. He comes from an island in the Mediterranean. He has an accent. He's darker skinned, but he's smart. He goes to France and joins the military. He goes to one of the elite military academies, and he studies artillery. So that means his job was aiming the cannons. And you might think, why is that a job? That's not that hard. Think about geometry. Think about physics. Think about all the math that has to go into figuring out where should we aim the cannon, at what angle should we aim the cannon up, how much gunpowder do we need to get it to go this far, how do we ensure that it's going fast enough when it makes impact in the castle wall to actually break through the castle wall. It's a whole thing. Napoleon is inherently dramatic, so dramatic. He is kind of lazy, a bit of a liar, and definitely a narcissist. But he's charismatic. He earns the support of soldiers. Um, he is a romantic at heart. He falls in love with a woman named Josephine, who was divorced and not really into him. And she consistently cheated on him, but it didn't matter to him. So after Robespierre, the entity in charge of France will be known as the Directory. The National Convention goes through lots of reform after Robespierre. They undo a lot of the most radical reforms, like getting rid of Sundays and making priests marry. And the executive entity is called the Directory. The idea is that those in the Directory will give up power after a certain amount of time, and they refuse to give up power at a certain point. Now, Napoleon had originally been a favorite of the Directory. He was very loyal to them. But eventually, he's going to be the one to overthrow the Directory in 1799. And then he will eventually declare himself Emperor of France from 1804 to 1815. If you don't know Hark a Vagrant, it is a very silly set of comics by Kate Beaton, a Canadian artist. And she, several years ago, drew many goofy historical comments, including ones about Napoleon and the French Revolution. So, Napoleon Bonaparte. He rises to power in 1799. He has the support of the military. So, what are they going to do? He is going to govern under the sort of national convention. He's not going to change too much at first. And like I said, his soldiers are incredibly loyal to him. He walks around among them. He shakes hands. He creates little medals for every battle. So you can, even if you're a common soldier, you'll have multiple medals on your chest. And you can say, I fought at this one and I fought at this one. I'm a survivor of this one. In 1804, though, he decides, this isn't cutting it for me. I don't want a republic. I want power. So he converts the republic into an authoritarian empire. So he is a popular authoritarian ruler. He's a dictator, but everyone likes him. He will also limit the power of the assembly and institute the Napoleonic Code. So the Napoleonic Code is going to actually be the foundation of French law today and a lot of European legal codes, in fact. Like I said, he is smart. It allows for equality under the law, the protection of property. He's an Enlightenment man as well. He's Red Locke. He's Red Rousseau. But he's a chauvinist, right? No rights for women. This is known as popular authoritarianism. So he still censors the press. He is going to punish political dissent. And then he's going to start invading the rest of Europe. He's the one who helps France finally get out of that war with Austria and Prussia because he defeats them. Then he forces them to be his allies. Then he conquers Italy, Spain, and Portugal in short succession. The Spain and Portugal part is going to have interesting consequences down the road. First of all, the king and queen of Portugal just beat it and go set up camp in Brazil. Secondly, the fact that France has conquered Spain is going to create a crisis of identity for the Spanish colonies in Latin America. But that's not the point. The point is he seems unstoppable. He even starts invading Egypt. Right? Only Britain is able to resist Napoleon, and that's mostly because of the English Channel. So then he decides, Russia. I'm taking Russia. I'm going to take Russia next. And as you might expect, he doesn't. Russia is going to be his Achilles heel. It's for a few reasons. 1, winter. 2, typhoid. And 3, it's just he's overstretched himself. So he will eventually be defeated in 1814 and exiled to the island of Elba, which is like a tiny island in the middle of the Atlantic. He escapes, returns to power, declares himself emperor again, governs for 100 days, goes to war with Britain again within that time period, and is defeated by the Duke of Wellington in the Battle of Waterloo. He's exiled again to a different island, St. Helena, where he eventually dies in 1821. But his actions encouraged nationalism throughout Europe. So, this is a really good TED Ed, History versus Napoleon. Was he a tyrant? Was he a revolutionary? You decide. How did Napoleon transfer the French Republic to a French empire? So, your summary for today, it looks like I don't actually have a slide in here for it. Just go back to that objective and answer that objective. How did the Enlightenment influence the French Revolution? As always, guys, you can find the PowerPoints and the resources on the Google Class. And if you want more information, just look on the YouTube playlists I've created that include lots of different videos for this topic and others from Unit 5. Thanks, guys.